C.S. Lewis was a famous author. Many of you may have read some of his books before, but he said this interesting quote. He said, "If Christianity is false, it is of no importance. But if it's true, there is nothing more important." If Christianity is false, it's of no importance, but if it's true, there's nothing more important. And it's a strong statement, isn't it? Because it leaves us with this question, is Christianity false or is it true? Christianity is a religion based on the belief in the person Jesus Christ and the beliefs and practices and the teachings of him. So tonight and next week, we're going to throw ourselves in somewhat of a courtroom setting where you're all the jury. You are going to make a decision on Jesus Christ. You'll make the decision whether Jesus is guilty of being true, guilty of being the Son of God, and whether he's guilty of being resurrected. You're going to be presented with facts that are going to be based on logic. Majority of the facts aren't actually going to be taken from the Bible at all. So we're not going to be turning up too many Bible quotes, and the ones that we are, will probably be more next week. In fact, as I said, very few facts are about the Bible, because if we're taking facts, statements from the Bible to prove the Bible true, we get ourselves in a bit of a, round and round type thing. So the purpose of this trial is to prove that the Bible is correct without using the Bible, that Jesus was and is the Son of God, and that he absolutely was resurrected. But as I said, that's going to be a decision for you to make. It's going to be an individual decision based on the facts that you'll hear. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, throughout this trial, I ask you to be impartial. I ask you to bring no preconceived thoughts to the trial. Many of us have been brought up as Christadelphians, and so we may be able to reel off many of the facts from our upbringing. But I ask you to put that to one side and really be able to listen to the facts, make notes on some pen and paper where appropriate, and to critically examine the evidence to make a decision for yourself. So we're going to look at this trial in 3 steps. We're going to examine the record. So is the Bible that we have on our lap, is it reliable? So as we said, it's not about what's written in the Bible, but it's more what we have, if that is reliable. We're going to analyse Jesus. We're going to look specifically at Jesus to see whether the records match up with him. We're going to look at records outside the Bible again to see what is written around the same time about Jesus. And we're going to research the resurrection. Is the resurrection actually a valid option? Is it something that could have happened? So, to examine the record, we're going to start with a simple question that can open up a whole can of worms. Is the record that we have accurate? Can the eyewitnesses be trusted? The people that saw and wrote about Christ, are they trustworthy people? And does their record and their recollection ring true? Is the statement or the record timely? Was it recorded in a time frame where memories don't fade and legends are formed? Was the statement accurate, or was there a bias where the apostles lied to make Jesus seem better than he was? Was there key information that was left out because it was embarrassing or hard to explain? Are the original copies of the texts through to the version we read today, correct? The Bibles on our laps obviously aren't the very original copies. They're not the ones that the apostles wrote. So we've got copies on our laps. Are they congruent with what was written in the original text? Is there corroborating evidence? Are there texts outside the Bible that validate the Bible records of Christ? And then what does science say? When we look at many cases that go through courtrooms, they'll have DNA, like blood samples and things like that. We don't have that, but we do have archaeology. So this is a form of science. Does that back up the story? So that's what we're going to look at tonight, but just to give a sneak peek of what we're going to look at next week, we're going to analyse Jesus as well. So, we're going to start with the premise that Jesus was tortured, crucified, died, was buried and resurrected. But if that's true, we need to be able to answer these questions. Did Jesus really die? If he didn't die, then he didn't need to be resurrected. Was he just unconscious on the cross and then put in a tomb, and then he revived and walked out of the tomb? What about the tomb? If we're using that as proof that Jesus rose to life, there are some key questions. Was the tomb actually empty? Did they look properly in all areas of the tomb? Was the right tomb looked at? Was it a tomb that was right next door and that one hadn't been filled just yet? Was Jesus actually put in an exclusive tomb? Or was he, like many of the people at the same age who had been crucified, just burnt and placed in a group grave, as was the custom? After analysing Jesus, we're going to research the resurrection. There were no eyewitnesses to the resurrection. An empty tomb doesn't mean a resurrection, does it? So did Jesus really come back to life? But we're going to start by examining the record. So this is an interactive court case. So I'm going to just pose a question to you, and there's no right or wrong answer. But if somebody told you a story about something that happened, so just think about this just in blanket terms. If someone told you a story about something that happened, what information would you need to know so that you can be convinced that it's true? Just take things on face value that they're true, you know. And I guess if we look at the content of what the person's saying, we want to be able to believe it somewhat. If I told you this morning I turned into a bird and I flew around the world, you would go, no, that's probably not correct. That's probably stretching the truth a little bit. The four Gospels, and there's I guess on face value you go, oh, there's a disparity between all of them. So I'm just going to read out these verses. Matthew 28 verse 1, after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. Mark says Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome bought spices, and very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. So this is the sun had risen, it's very early, so you know, is that dawn or is it not? We've got Mary Magdalene, and then we've got Mary, the mother of James and Salome. Then we've got Luke 23. So we've got the women, Mary Magdalene, Joanna. So we haven't heard about Joanna before. She's someone new that's on the scene. Who had come with them at early dawn. So it's not just dawn, it's early dawn. Then John 20 verse 1, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene. Okay, so did Joanna and the other Mary not come? Came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So, you know, we look at these four Gospels and we go, okay, what's going on here? It's a simple story. Surely we can have, you know, the correct words between all of them. But really aren't all correct. It's just as correct to say Mary came to the tomb as saying Mary and Joanna came to the tomb. And it's just as true to say very early in the morning as it is to say it was dawn. And is dawn, has the sun actually risen then, or is it just before the sun's rising? You know, it's slightly a matter of perspective. But the key facts that we do get out of this story is that there was women. We know for a fact that there was Mary and Joanna. They came very early. They came to see the tomb. But let's get into examining the record. So we're going to race through many of the aspects of this evidence. So if you want to take notes, be prepared. But our first question for the night is, can the biographies of Christ and the eyewitness evidence be trusted? So before we look at that, I just want to say the value of an eyewitness. A judge was quoted as saying, an eyewitness testimony can be compelling and convincing when an eyewitness has ample opportunity to observe a crime, when there is no ulterior motive or bias, when the witness is truthful and fair. There is often no greater proof. It's quite a big statement. In summary, it's saying that eyewitness accounts are absolutely critical and compelling, provided that they've had the opportunity to observe it. There's no ulterior motive. So we're going to pick apart these pieces here. You know, did they observe it? Did they have any ulterior motive? Were they truthful and fair? So we said before, the most important part of an eyewitness record is that we're hearing it from the eyewitness, that they have actually witnessed it themselves. For credibility, we need to ensure that we have an original copy of the record. Hearing from a friend of a friend, as we had before, doesn't count as an eyewitness testimony. We want to be sure that the original texts are preserved through to our version. So that leads us on to, I guess, our next question is, are the eyewitness testimonies that we have today actually what the eyewitness testified? For example, is the version of Bible that we have on our laps, is that actually accurate? Well, we know that the original letters that were written have unfortunately been destroyed, but that doesn't mean that we have lost the originals. One of the ways that we can be convinced that we know what the originals actually say is through the number of copies that we do have. The more copies that you have that agree with each other, especially if they come from multiple geographic locations, the more reliable they are, because you can cross-check each one to figure out what the original document was like. It's much similar to, witnesses to an event. If we only have one witness to an event, there is a possibility that it may not be correct because the eyewitness may have an agenda or even an exaggeration of an event. So we may never know the full truth. But if we have many witnesses, the probability that what we've got is incorrect becomes minute. For example, if I asked you to write down on a piece of paper an excerpt from a diary entry from one of our members, it says, "Dear diary, even though I'm taller than Mason, I still look up to him as my hero. Until tomorrow, Phil Milliken." So if we access Phil's diary and we saw that one in there and we all wrote it down on a piece of paper to say, this is what Phil's diary said, and unfortunately Phil has a fire in his house and that diary is destroyed, we've got a number of copies to show that that is exactly what Phil has written in his diary. So I guess it's important to have a number of copies, but before we look at the Bible, let's have a look at some other significant historical accounts. Now, I've gone back a very long way to go in time period around the Bible, not looking at something that is more recent. I guess it's good to compare apples with apples, as they say. So on the screen, I've got a number of old writings. I'll tell you a tiny little bit of history about each one. But we've got when they were written, when we've actually got the earliest copy of those those originals there. The time span between when it was written and when we've got the original, and the number of copies that we do have. So the 12 Caesars, we'll start with that one. So that was written in 100 to 44 BC, and the earliest copy that we have is 900 AD, so 1,000 years. That's a pretty long time. I haven't done all of the fact checking on this, but I believe it is all correct. And we've got 10 copies of those originals. Just so you're aware, the Caesars, the 12 Caesars is a significant book, and it remains a primary source on Julius Caesar and the 11 emperors. Tacitus was a Roman historian and politician. Many of us have probably heard of Tacitus before. He's widely considered the greatest Roman historian. His writings are the same timeline as Caesar's, however there are twice as many copies at 20 compared to Caesar's 10. Aristotle's writings were in 384 BC, and the earliest copy was from 1100 AD, so that's 1400 years later, and we've got 5 copies of the originals. And Josephus, which we do quote from time to time, his writings were toward the end of the 1st century, with the earliest copy in 1000 AD, which is some 900 years later, and we've got 9 copies of those as well. So many of us would have heard of those names. No one disputes what they wrote about, and no one disputes that they existed in history. And in fact, the number of copies is actually quite high. If you think about it, if you treat each copy as an eyewitness, if we've got 20 copies or 20 eyewitnesses to something, it is pretty much indisputable. So even though you're going, wow, that's not too many, it actually is pretty significant in as history goes. But streaks ahead of those writings is a Greek poem called Homer's Iliad. That was written in 800 BC. The first copy was 200 AD, so still 1,000 years later. But we've got a whopping 650 copies. So Homer's Iliad was essentially the Bible of the ancient Greeks. So it talks about the Trojan War and things like that. So that places Homer's Iliad is placed as second on the list. The Bible, if we put what the Bible was in there, so written, and this is based on the New Testament, not the Old Testament writings, because it's the case for Christ. So date written around 100 AD, the earliest copy 150 AD. So we're talking a time span of 50 years. Now, there's some arguments about how we can get that even closer than 50 years, but I've just gone for worst case scenario here. The amount of copies that we've got of the original is 24,000. That is a whopping amount. That is, by streaks, the head of any other historical writing to go. But basically, it's just a mountain of manuscripts to prove the Bible is correct. So we mentioned the time frame in there, and I guess why is that important? Well, the closer that it is to the original, then the more recent, the more reliable. The longer the time is, legends start to grow. Mythological ideas start to creep in, stories of greatness. If I use an example in some of our lifetimes here, in cricket, not a massive cricket tragic, but here's a fact for you. The fastest bowl that was ever bowled was by a bowler called Shoaib Akhtar, who bowled 161 kilometres per hour, which is a very fast bowl. If you ask people that are in their 60s today, they'll tell you that there's an Australian bowler called Jeff Thompson who regularly bowled over 180 kilometres per hour, so Shoaib Akhtar's got absolutely nothing to talk about. That's ludicrous in my mind. That's 10% faster than Shoaib Akhtar, which is just ridiculous. That's like saying before sprint guns, there was a sprinter who could run a whole second faster than Usain Bolt, so he's finishing, 15, 20 metres, running 100 metres at 8.5. So it's just one of those things that legends start to grow over time. And for us, we live in an instant world, don't we? Something happens over the other side of the world, we hear about it on Twitter, Facebook, or whatever, the news straight away. Sort of the longest time that goes is about 15 to 20 seconds as people scramble to type it up. History is not like that, as we can see on the screen. The majority of history, there's centuries that do go past before records are actually written down. And for example, if we look at Alexander the Great, you may not know, some of those things up there, but good fair chance we've all heard of Alexander the Great. Well, the most recent biographies, recent in relation to when Alexander died, were written by people called Plutarch and Arrian. These biographies were written in the 1st century and the 2nd century respectively, so that is some 300 to 400 years after Alexander died. So as we said, the Gospels were written in the first century there, between 50 to 90 AD, which is less than 30 years after Jesus dies. So that's history's version, I guess, of a news flash or breaking news. And importantly, this is all within the lifetime of the authors. So I guess to answer our question, are the eyewitness testimonies that we have today actually what they testified? Absolutely. And the way that we can say that is because we've got that mountain of copies of the original, and the time frame that we have is well within the lifetime. So let's have a look at the authors now. Are the eyewitnesses reliable? So the eyewitnesses, let's just use the Gospels. The eyewitnesses here, we've got four different people. We've got a tax collector, an author or interpreter, a doctor, and a fisherman. So they're hardly the who's who of the world, where people like to claim their identity. But they're not men who would gain in their life by being an eyewitness to Christ, from a worldly sense. They don't have a hidden agenda that's going to benefit them in their current life. They wouldn't personally benefit. It's unlikely that a fisherman is going to be able to sell more fish just by saying that he knew Jesus. There's no question that the apostles and authors of the Bible were men of integrity, because they lived out their beliefs, doing harm to no one, despite being persecuted, deprived, and suffering, which does show great character, doesn't it? There's a school of thought that says when you love somebody, you see the good in them. no matter what they do. So I guess we ask the question, is there a chance that the disciples were so devoted, the author of the Gospels so devoted that they changed things in their record to make Jesus look good? And if so, that does make their testimony unreliable. And so yes, the potential for that to happen is there. But it also can prompt them to honour and respect Jesus so much because they loved him so much, that they record his life with complete integrity. And I think there's a fair argument for that school of thought as well, because the disciples had nothing to gain by writing this and to follow Jesus except for being ostracised and persecuted. If anything, they would have had pressure to actually keep quiet, to deny Jesus, to downplay, and even forget that they met him. If everything that was written about wasn't true, why would you put yourself through that? They could have even said that they forgot that they met him, and instead they proclaimed him even when it resulted in persecution and death. Now, just another sort of consideration. When people testify about events that they saw, they'll often leave out details that are embarrassing for them or hard to explain. As a result, this raises questions about the whole testimony, because if there's been some parts that have been left out for one reason, then it seems that the testimony has been twisted. And it doesn't appear that happened in the gospel record. If we read different sections, there's stories that are embarrassing for the disciples. Peter is constantly unflattering, being rebuked by Christ. The disciples are often squabbling. The disciples repeatedly misunderstand Jesus, and they often look like a group of self-serving, self-seeking people. And please take this for the respect that I do have for them. I'm just trying to paint a picture here. So we know that the authors were comfortable with selecting what they wanted to go on record, because John's gospel ends with saying all the books in the world couldn't contain the things that Jesus said. But if they weren't comfortable enough to leave out the things that weren't, comfortable or convenient for them, is it likely that they withheld or added content that had no historical basis? Probably not. So if we recap this little section, the authors did not have a personal gain or benefit, so they wouldn't be motivated to lie or stretch the truth in their record. The record is timely. It's not hundreds of years later, where time allows for legends and mythical memories to be formed. Now, even if the authors intended to reliably record history, were they able to do so? How can we be sure that the material of Jesus' life and teachings was well preserved for 30 years before it was actually written down in the Gospels? And I think it's if we put aside that we know in the Bible it says that the apostles and the authors were influenced by the Holy Spirit. If we put that one aside, it's important to actually remember the time frame in when they were written, because back in those days there's no computers. That's an obvious one, but there was no printers. There was only a certain amount of people that actually could read and write in those days. So everything was passed down orally. In my research, basically it came up that storytellers would deviate 10 to 40% in what they're telling. However, the key ideas would never be altered. And I think that's important to have in the back of our mind, to go, if we look at the Bible, or let's look at an example. If we go back to our diary excerpt that we got from Phil's diary, there's parts here that may be able to be left out. If I was telling you the story of Phil's diary and I dropped the Dear Diary, does that affect the story? No, it doesn't. If I drop out the Until Tomorrow, does that affect what was written in the diary? Absolutely not. But if I dropped out the ideas of Phil being taller but still looking up to Mason, or Mason being his hero, or the characters of Phil and Mason, you absolutely couldn't omit those, because that's the key information. So from a historical point of view, when we're looking at things from that time frame, again, we know that the authors were inspired by the Holy Spirit, but if they weren't, the key ideas absolutely were passed down from generation to generation. Harvard Law School professor, who's actually regarded as one of the most important legal figures ever, actually was given the task of studying the consistency between the four Gospels. And he said this quote, "There is enough of a discrepancy to show that there could have been no previous concert amongst them, and at the same time such substantial agreement to show that they are all independent narrators of the same great transaction." Essentially, if there's too many similarities between the whole story and too consistent, it would invalidate the Gospels as independent witnesses. People would start to say that we've just got one eyewitness account and the rest are just parroting. So let's come back to our question. Are the eyewitnesses reliable? There's no personal gain in their lifetime for the records. It opened them up for suffering and persecution, yet they still testified, which shows great character. Their jobs, they weren't bank robbers. They were just standard jobs. They testified, and that talks about their character as well. They testified when it put them in bad light for the sake of truth. The consistency between the eyewitness records shows that they're independent witnesses that saw the same great events and recorded it. So the court's going to be adjourned for this week, and we're going to come back next week. But before we do, we're just going to recap on everything that we have seen, the evidence that we've looked at tonight. Can the biographies of Christ be trusted? Can the eyewitness evidence be trusted? Well, we hear directly from the eyewitnesses, which is really important. And when we compare this to other religions, that doesn't happen. Other religions, some of the more common ones, there's one person who has had a vision and writes it down. There's one person's teachings that people pass on. This is from the eyewitnesses of many who saw what happened. Many, everything that was written down could be corroborated, and it also could be contradicted if it was false. There was a massive amount of people who was watching it to go, no, that actually isn't correct, and be able to knock those ones down straight away. We can have confidence in what the original texts say because of the mountain of manuscripts. We absolutely can be confident that we know what was in the originals. We have confidence due to the recency of the manuscripts being within the lifetime of the event compared to other prominent historical writings, which are in some instances over 1,000 years old. The actual testimony from the eyewitnesses we can be confident we've recorded correctly. But what about the testimony itself? Can we trust that? Well, as we said, there's no personal gain in their lifetime. It opened them up for suffering and persecuted, yet they still testified. They testified when it puts them in bad light, and the consistency shows that they were independent. So can we trust the eyewitnesses and can we trust the testimonies that we have? Absolutely. Next week, we're going to analyse Jesus and research the resurrection to see whether the actual content of the testimony is true, able to be trusted and able to be relied upon.